When I was 19, working unarmed security, I was placed as a flex officer at a retirement home, while the regular officer went on vacation. The first 2 shifts were learning the main care hospice building and learning the apartment and cottage buildings for the independent seniors. Usually, we only had to check the outer buildings a couple of times a night to make sure no one was wandering around or no wildlife were getting in the trash. But my experiences began in the main building on the second shift, after the regular officer had left for his vacation. One of the morbid duties that didn't happen very often was escorting a body from the facility with the coroner and usually the family of the resident. On that night, a very elderly woman passed around 1 a.m. with her daughter and grandsons around her. Just after 1:45 a.m., I greeted the coroner at the service entrance and we took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The ride was unsettling. Both myself and the coroner were in absolute silence during that elevator ride that seemed to take for hours. My eyes were fixated on the gurney donning a reddish body bag with a funeral home logo. I stood at the room door as the family cried as the nurse and coroner took possession of the woman's now lifeless form. All of us, including the family, walked onto the elevator to go to the ground level to see her off in the medical van, and as it pulled away, the grandsons thanked and shook my hand for my assistance, though I felt as I had done nothing. For the rest of the night, it seemed slow yet eerie. I kept thinking about that gurney with the body bag and how life is uncertain. The following night, I was sitting at the welcome desk, sitting across from the on-duty nurse who had dozed off. I was reading a book about the history of the occult when I noticed from across the main reception hall, where entertainers or youth groups come to lighten the spirits of the residents, the dessert carousel machine with its dim soft white light flickered. It didn't flicker due to an electric default, but instead as if someone was standing in front of it or walked past it. I walked out to see if a resident was maybe looking for a late night treat, but the area was void of anyone but myself. I brushed off the oddity as just my eyes acting up, but as soon as I returned to the desk, the grand piano that sat halfway between the dessert carousel and my desk struck 3 keys. I began to get spooked, so I decided now was the best time to do a property check. As I was returning down the last resident hall towards the reception area, I heard the music of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I felt my blood go cold. I staggered towards the reception area, hoping to see a resident or even the nurse. But as soon as I hit the threshold into the reception area, it fell dead silent. I nervously checked to see if it were a player's piano, but found that it required a pianist. As I was still inspecting the piano with my light, the nurse walked over. "Why did you stop playing? It was really nice." I turned with confusion and a little fear. That wasn't me. The nurse's face went white. "Stone, do you know what time it is?" She extended her wrist to where I saw the time, 1:07 a.m. We both went out to the smoking area, which was absolutely not permitted for resident safety reasons. Shortly after, the nurse refused to be left alone, so I accompanied her while she did her rounds checking on all the residents. While on the 3rd floor, 2 doors down from the recently deceased woman's room, we heard faint music. The family was still in the process of removing her items. One item left on her nightstand we found was the source of the soft, haunting song. Sitting there was a small music box, playing a haunting version of Moonlight Sonata.
As some of you may know, I am an armed uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Knight's Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously 2 separate motels, but when the Knight's Inn bought it, they merged the properties into one. During nearly 20 years of running both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just happened to be within walking distance from the county jail, so when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way to this motel over the years. murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on the property during the overnight hours, and the 3 events during 3 separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first on my 4th shift. The first few went very slow and boring. No one had told my staff of the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to the last week of operation, I was helping the on-duty auditor prepare the morning breakfast bar, and the kitchen was in part of the building where a long shutdown restaurant was. The auditor was preparing waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to a service access stairwell that was padlocked from the inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The auditor's scream was chilling as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less upstanding guests they rent rooms to. I began down the stairs to find that the doors were still secured, and no one could have entered through it. I then stuck my finger in the puddle of soda, thinking that maybe it had been overheated, or something caused them to burst. But no, it was slightly cool. As I looked at the auditor, still shaking, holding a small kitchen knife trying to calm her down, we both heard a little loud girl giggle, but it sounded unusual. Needless to say, we both bolted from the kitchen back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me, "No one who checked in tonight has any kids." The following week, and the last of the location being open before the remodel, I was doing standard ground patrolling, making sure no doors were unsecured or people were fighting. Just about the time I finished, I get a call from the front desk, calling a Code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the stairs in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young black woman with her daughter, just the cutest little 3-year-old you'll ever see. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself. That after nearly an hour in their room, he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room, and at his wife and child. The wife said that he hates weapons and wouldn't have had one, so I began searching the grounds for the man, and found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard area. He had the knife in his hand, and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw blood. When I noticed he was bleeding, I ordered that he drop the knife as he slowly started to walk towards me. I repeated a second time. Then on the third order, I drew my weapon, and ordered that he stop, and to think about his child. Right as I did, 3 local officers sprang from behind me, 2 with their CEWs, which are tasers. In a quickly happening display, I heard the deputy order, then followed, taser, taser, taser. The local officers took the man in custody, and was having me fill out a statement when I overheard 2 of the deputies saying, "Want to know what's odd? The room they are staying in has had a suspicious death a few years ago, but detectives say it was a drug-induced suicide." The other deputy replied, "Huh? What are the odds this guy went nuts? I think personally that that's a little odd, especially that a man committed suicide. Come to find out, he cut his arm till he bled out, and then a week later another man loses his mind, cuts himself up, and is unresponsive the whole time he is being spoken to." The most damning paranormal event, in my opinion, that happened was the first week closed for remodeling. I was walking around the inside, and another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that he sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was for real haunted. He reluctantly agreed, using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night, I thought I overpaid for it. We sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes, nothing came through, and we joked that maybe the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it, but come to find out my flashlight had died. So while sitting at the table, I pulled my taser out of the holster as we sat in a nearly pitch-black room to use its light if needed. Instantly, the spirit box app said, "Yellow? Gun?" in the same voice. Now mind you that me and this other officer had the same level of training, and were fully certified through the city, but his response was, "The fuck does it mean by yellow gun?" I then proceeded to place my taser on the table, and turned its light on. I've never heard so many F-bombs as he stormed out of that room. The final incident I am unsure of, but the one phrase the suspect yelled, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." 4 weeks after the motel closed, I was working a city patrol when the on-duty officer called for priority backup from all available officers on duty. Sam 626 to Knight's Inn. What is the situation? 4 to 6 people have entered into the back building and barricaded themselves into a room. I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m. and met with the on-duty site officer. As we were talking and a third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ringing out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within several minutes, deputies arrived in ASV, active shooter vests, and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway, and luckily no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the 3 of us were. A survivor for the deputies orders 4 to watch the hallway as the rest took position around the building. We asked what we needed to do, and he replies to block the entrances to the property, and no one comes on that isn't an officer. So basically we were to keep out the impending reporters. SWAT arrived, and the deputies pulled back, and SWAT took their position. The whole time the suspects saw the activity from the window and holes in the door. An LT with SWAT and a public relations officer came over to me, and the other guys on my staff, and while asking us what happened before deputies responded, we all heard from a broken-out window, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." Around 5 a.m., the SWAT armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we hear 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching from the windows and doorway. Just as soon as we hear the thumps and see the smoke, 5 of the suspects were being carried out, and a 6th was being rushed out on a straight board to an ambulance. Come to find, the man with a pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital, so I wonder if he joined the other ghosts in the motel. After that night, we no longer provided security at the Knight's Inn. 8 months later, it reopened as some new aged hipster hotel. I haven't been on that property for some time now, even though I pass it whenever I work our South City patrol. I wonder how the property is, and if paranormal activity still happens after the remodel.
I'm an armed private security officer in Colorado Springs, and over the last few months, my company has been doing a specific property check within a community we already patrol at night. 1315 Wood Ave has an interesting past, better known as the Burns Mansion on the Old Millionaires Row in the Old North End. James Ferguson Burns, who died in Colorado Springs, was a very wealthy man across his numerous endeavors in the greater Colorado area. His death was suspected in the mansion on September 23, 1917, as well as a few servants on the property. Earlier this year, 2020, acting as an 8-unit apartment building, a suspicious death occurred on the property, prompting the city to step in. After conducting the police and forensic investigation of the death, the city immediately shut down the entire property to be renovated and brought up to modern code. But this event displaced all the tenants and families with no warning. It was said that James Burns dabbled in spiritualism via spirit boards and mediums. On the night of September 21st, I was the patrol officer on duty for that area. Our normal SOP for the property is to check around the enormous house to ensure the primary structure is secured, and that area homeless have not made entry. After dismounting from my cruiser, I began to check the street side of the property, starting with the front cellar access, which had no out-of-the-normal signs, a discarded coffee cup from one of the contractors, and a few piles of wood, etc. I started towards the grand patio that nearly wraps the whole front-facing side. At the far end, I noticed the porch swing was slightly swaying side to side, not back and forth, but thought nothing of it as this home is an old location. I then began around to the rear of the mansion, and as soon as I came around the gate, I heard a staggered, elderly man's voice faintly coming from the servants' quarters on the second floor of the carriage house. So instead of checking the rear of the mansion first, I followed SOP and went straight to investigate the sounds. At the mouth to the carriage house was all the discarded personal items of the tenants that were displaced and they were unable to collect, making a path to the stairs an uneasy trek. Old furniture, toys, photos, and the like covered most of the ground. While trying not to fall while making my way, I heard the elderly voice again, but it was still faint and unintelligible. Now knowing that the possibility of an intruder was nearly 100%, I drew my sidearm and clasped my light between my fingers. I announced myself in the loudest commanding tone I could manage, leaving no doubt that I wouldn't be heard. After the second attempt of commanding that anyone identify themselves failed, I moved up the stairs. The second level was in such a state of decay that it looked as if it were a setting for a horror movie. After clearing the small 4-room area, I had only a small walk-in closet left, thinking surely this is where the subject was. I kept my sidearm level as I whipped the door open with my opposite hand. Nothing. There was nothing in that space. I holstered, thinking maybe I just had too much or too little caffeine, or a raccoon was being playful. I exited the carriage house to resume checking the mansion door barricades to ensure they were either locked or undamaged. While at the parlor doorway, I saw a shadow from behind the door under the slight split at the bottom. Aggravated, I ran to the parlor window, flashing the entire room to see who in the hell was walking around inside. Again, nothing. No sign that anything had been inside since earlier that day. Now pissed that so many weird things were happening, I checked the rest of the doors, which were all locked. I headed back to the cruiser and lit a cigarette. As I took a long, exasperated drag, the inside lights flicked off briefly. I looked up to the second floor, where a discolored face peered out before the lights sprang back on. I flicked my cigarette butt and said to myself, yeah, screw that. Jumped into the car and called out, 1315 code 4, clearing.